My first task, a very pleasant one it is to welcome our guest, the Right Honourable Baroness Ashton of Upholland, GCMG PC, and we'll be saying a little bit more about her in due course. I've got a bit of housekeeping to keep, some of which will be important for the second half of our meeting. Can I first of all welcome all of you for attending to the National Liberal Club. It is something of a home from home for me, but I won't turn this into a political occasion. And can I also welcome those who are joining us online. The housekeeping is this, that the next GSF event will be here on the Wednesday, the 22nd of March. It's a joint meeting co-hosted with Oxford Media Network, and the theme is the broadcast battleground, how the media shapes military decision-making. And taking part there is former CGS General Sir Nicholas Carter and Sunday Times journalist Maneen Rana. And invitations in the usual form will be sent out in the course of this week. Now, today's event is a hybrid one, and any of those who are listening, watching remotely, who wish to ask a question, will you please submit that in writing through the Q&A function? And those who are here and who want to ask a question, please raise your hands, give your name, and please wait for the handheld microphone. Baroness Ashcroft's biography was set out in detail in the invitation, but the two things which leap out of her curriculum vitae for me are the fact that she was the first ever High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy for the European Union, and previously she was the first woman to be EU Trade Commissioner, and before that, I think the first woman to be the Leader of the House. No? No,
there were a few.
There were a few, very well. So we are here to talk about her book. I've read it, and I say, since I have no interest in its promotion, other than to say it is a very good read, and I recommend it to you, both here and elsewhere. It poses a question, as you may have seen from the dust cover, then what? And I certainly was unable to put it down. The formula is this, that
Cathy,
our guest is going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes about the book and about some other dimensions of her responsibility and her experience, and perhaps a comment or two about where we stand in one or two rather difficult areas of the world. And then there will be an opportunity to purchase the book and to have it duly signed. And as I say, this is a very good read and well worth picking up. On that basis, therefore, let me begin by inviting Baroness Ashton to speak to us for about 15 or 20 minutes. Then I'll have a conversation with her about 10, and then we will move to questions, of which I'm pretty certain there's going to be quite a few. Over to you.
thank you. What I was pointing to was that if you wouldn't mind calling me Cathy, because you do, I know, and always call me that, and I prefer it. It's the title always gets a bit in the way, doesn't it? So if we're asking questions, please, Cathy is perfectly fine. It's wonderful to be here with you. I've long admired everything that you've achieved, and I wanted to just say thank you to Jacqueline for all the work she's done to pull this together, and to say to Michael, who's not with us, who I hope is watching and listening, that we miss him, and I look forward to seeing him very soon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here online. I thought I'd just start with a few things that kind of give you the reasons that I wrote the book and that I learnt in my time in office. And then it's just a way of giving us a sort of starting point, because the conversation is always the best bit for me. The questions, if I can answer them, I certainly will try. if you go back to the period I was in office, it was, in its way, one of the most turbulent periods of history. We had dramatic changes going on across the world, and the problem when you're in the middle of a dramatic change is that you don't know where it will end. You sometimes don't know what you're looking at. You look at a screen, a television screen, and see something, and you're trying constantly to interpret it. And in a world where the expectation is that you will move quickly, that becomes harder and harder, in the sense that you're trying also to be measured and calm and think carefully. The book title comes from that period of time because it was the question I asked most frequently when I met with officials or with leaders or with foreign ministers. I would say to them very often, yeah, that's great, and then what? What do we do next? What follows on from this? So it's a very deliberately posed question. And when I was looking at what to call the book, the people who read it early on said to me unanimously, you've got to call it And Then What? So in the context of that, there were three particular points I wanted to pick up today. The first is that when you look at dealing with any of the turbulent issues and events that took place then or now, I think you have to start by thinking what I call comprehensively. When I first started in 2009, the biggest issue that faced Europe and indeed the world was piracy off the coast of Somalia. Now that feels like a very long time ago, but the 30,000 ships that traversed that huge expanse of water every year brought food to the poorest in the world through the World Food Programme, and of course huge amounts of trade would travel. And we were running into an increasing accuracy of attack from pirate groups, many of whom were being funded by warlords or organised crime, that had begun due to the chaos in Somalia, which had left the fishing fleets being unable to operate, toxic waste being dumped into the sea, and a sense of chaos that had been going on for over 20 years at that point. When I worked with the military to establish Operation Atalanta's work in providing a corridor, a safe corridor for all ships to be able to move across that area of sea, and developed with the countries around the region a way to deal with pirates who we captured, both in terms of imprisoning them, but as importantly rehabilitating them, because many of them were 15, 16-year-old boys who had the offer of $10,000 if they took part in capturing a ship, or maybe, if they were lucky, $2 a day back on land. We had to think, what are we going to do in the longer term? The and then what question. And it became pretty clear, using that as just one example, that we could only achieve this, as the military would put it to me, if we solve the problem on the land. We may see the manifestation on the sea, in the shape of the pirates and the boats, and the hostages and the captures, but what we're really dealing with is the problem of chaos on the land. And getting to the point where I was able to eventually go to Mogadishu to talk to a fledgling government with a new president was of itself a remarkable achievement. But my goodness, we're still at the very beginning of helping Somalia move forward. There are good signs, but we're still a long way from that. So my first sort of thought on this is that you need to think comprehensively. In that context, it was about young men with very little prospects. It was about how do you imprison people locally so their families could visit them. It was about how do you rehabilitate people, give them training. It is about projects that can operate on the ground. It was about supporting the African Union troops who were getting rid of Al-Shabaab, who had taken over huge areas. It was supporting communities that needed healthcare and education. And it was running a big campaign with the government called Get Rid of Your Guns and Go to School, which was really important for the youngsters who'd simply only known civil war, and actually using education as an opportunity to get them away from that. Everything needed to be done. Finding ways to develop, as we did, a program long-term that would demand a lot from the fledgling government, but would also offer a lot, was a really big part of it. So, if you like, number one thing for me you need a comprehensive approach. You simply will not solve the problem if you think short term and if you think only about the one aspect of the problem that you see. The second is to take you into the world of what we call the Arab Spring. We don't call it that in the region. Spring, as some of you know, is not a particularly lovely time in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. It's full of sandstorms that come on the Sirocco winds. And they kind of see the fact that we call it that as an expression of the European way that we view the world, rather than calling it something that would make more relevance to their life and to the reality of what happens. But in that sort of wind that blew across and made huge changes from Tunisia, the beginnings of the decision by Mohamed Bouazizi, who could not get a permit to sell the fruit and vegetables that he needed to get to help his family, and then set fire to himself, dying some weeks later. That incident, which was, if you like, about economics mixed with the politics of corruption at the time, led to the dramatic changes that we all remember, particularly in Egypt, but also in Libya, and demonstrations that carried on through the whole region. One of the propositions, if you like, that was put forward was that this was an opportunity to develop democracy for the future. Some countries it didn't exist at all. In other countries it kind of existed, but it was not as we would wish it to be. I met so many people standing in Tahrir Square, huge grins on their faces, believing this was the moment that things could change. Going to Benghazi in Libya and meeting with lots of young people, including one who'd been in jail for a long time, but who believed passionately that what was needed was, as he put it, we want what you've got. You have democracy as a way of life. That translated far too quickly, in a way, into the obvious manifestation of a democracy, which is an election. And one of the things that I think we need to be mindful of is the journey that democracy is on in every country and the length of the journey. When in Egypt they talked about having elections very quickly, I said, elections are really important, of course, but how will people know who to vote for? How do you know you're going to have free and fair elections? What are the elements of democracy that go alongside it? And I developed a term to describe what I meant, which I call deep democracy. When we look at our system, what do we have? We have a free press. We have civil society that operates all over the country. We have the ability of the judiciary to be independent. We have a police force that works for us, not against us. We have political parties that may struggle at times to get all the funding they need, but that are able and capable to get their messages out. We have the ability to give people choices. Is it perfect? Probably not. Is it trying to be perfect? Probably yes. But it exists, and it's existed for a long time. I would say to them the journey from Magna Carta in 1215 to now has been a very long one. And only in the last 100 years or so have people who look like me been able to vote. So it's not always quick and easy to get the kind of depth of democracy that you need. And so I would argue that when we think about how we address the and then what question, one of the things we need to think about is making sure that the roots of democracy go very deep. It's too easy to watch, as we've seen in Myanmar and we've seen in countries all over the world, for the beginnings of democracy to seem to appear only for it to be absolutely dashed. The tree is uprooted and thrown away because there is not enough underneath it to hold it together. And so in terms of thinking how we can support and help countries going through change, I think it's important to remember that it should be about building civil society, dealing with the judiciary, sorting out election systems that are free and fair, but also where people can have real choices because the information is available. I'm not in favour of delaying elections. I'm not suggesting that. What I am in favour of is remembering it can take a long time to build a democratic future, and it isn't a straight line. It wobbles all over the place. In practically every country, it doesn't do what you want it to do at times. And therefore, you have to make sure that it's able to achieve what it can in the longer term. And then my final point, and there are lots more I could make, but for these purposes, let me finish with this, starts with a story that's in the book about going to see the terracotta warriors in Xi'an in China. And I met the chief archaeologist there, and she said to me that the terracotta army is, they believe, the outer circle of all of the treasures that lie and lead to where the first emperor of China is buried. And I said, gosh, that's really interesting. And she pointed to a kind of hill, a little mound in the distance, and said, we think that may be where we will find the kind of center of this. And I said, that's fabulous. When will you start excavating? And she said, I think probably in about 50 years. And I said to her, my goodness, so it's a long time. So you won't necessarily, well, you certainly won't be chief archaeologist then. And she said, no, but you have to think about the longer term. Not everything can be done now. And it brought home to me that when we think about how we tackle problems and issues, that we need to be long-term in our thinking. Most of the crises that I dealt with had bubbled up or had roots that went back a very long time. If you think about the Serbia-Kosovo agreement, that goes back. They can talk about the Battle of 1389 in a heartbeat, and do. If you think about the relationship with Iran, they can go back to 1953 and the removal of the democratically elected leader, and a lot further than that. You can look at the crisis from the earthquake in Haiti and see that from 1955 we've been providing aid, but it's a country that still has abject poverty and is now in a terrible situation, especially with gangs in control of the country, or large parts of it, and so on. So why do we think we can solve problems in 6 months or 2 years? Why do we put funding in that only lasts a certain length of time? Why do we think one generation of girls going to school is sufficient to change a culture that has established that women are not to be part of the mainstream, sometimes over many, many years? We have to think longer term and establish the capacity to do what we need to do over that longer term. If we don't, then the problems that exist outside, one way or another, affect us in the longer term. And so it is about invest to save. It's about investing for the future in ways that will support our ability and our capacity to live the lives that we want to have. So making sure that we think longer term is really important. And there's a little kind of attachment to that, which is, as I said at the beginning, when you live in a world of 24-hour media and everybody's got a camera, so there's always the ability to see what's happening in real time, it's harder and harder for diplomacy to do its quiet drip, drip job in places where it needs to keep working. And so the reason I wrote the book more than anything was to say thank you, because diplomats, and there'll be some of them here, do such incredible work. And as I point out, they're never in the front line of the photograph. If you see the photograph of the agreement, look who's in the second, third, or hiding around the back, because they're probably the people that have spent months and years actually working on something. But I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Well, let's, if we may, dig down a little bit. You found yourself as the Commissioner for Trade. How did that come about? You were the leader of the House of Lords, and there was a Labour government, and suddenly you found yourself in Brussels.
I did. It was a Friday morning, and my phone kept ringing, and I couldn't work out why the BBC journalist who was trying to ring me was ringing me. Leaders of the Lords don't generally get a lot of press interest. And I was walking home, and my husband said, come and look at this. And Peter Mandelson, who you'll all know, was returning from Brussels to come to support the Labour government. And my name was the name that was going around the ticker tape at the bottom as the person replacing him. It went round for some hours before anybody actually contacted me. during which I managed to have a very nice bottle of champagne with Lord Strathclyde, my opposite number, who roared with laughter, as I say in the book, when he discovered that I had no idea what was happening. And those of you who've been near government know you can't do anything until you're officially told. So it was sort of a very strange period. But by that evening, I was in Brussels.
Right.
And what I didn't know was I'd be there for the next 6 years. So
You weren't waiting for Godot, but you were waiting for Gordon, weren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, the way that the systems work, particularly in something that was a little bit unusual, going to Brussels, it just got a bit caught up in people thinking other people have done something. Yeah. But if you're on the receiving end, it was quite a day. Yeah. And packing a bag and trying to get my passport, which was at home outside London, so I could actually get to Brussels. It was quite something.
Well, what did you think when you got there?
Well, strangely enough, I'd just been there because I'd taken the Lisbon Treaty, as you will recall, through the House of Lords, and I had gone to Brussels to thank people for some of the information they'd given me about the detail, because it was a controversial bill for sure, but also there's a lot of detail in it, and they'd helpfully given me some explanations. And in the course of the discussions, I'd actually sat with Peter Mandelson in his office, talking about we didn't know what was about to happen. And I remember the press not believing that we had sat together 3 days before and didn't know what was about to happen. Maybe he did, but I certainly didn't.
What was the response? You were parachuted in almost, in a sense, weren't you?
I was. The big question, I think, was for the retention of the trade portfolio, that Britain was doing a great job. Peter had done a great job on it, and it needed to be continued. So getting there was important. And I was the first woman that Britain ever sent to Brussels. And if we stay out of Brussels, I'll be the last. I'm not used to being the last, I'm used to being the first. And I was the first woman to be given the trade portfolio as well, which was, it's something that actually I didn't appreciate until I was starting to do it. And somebody said, you do realise there's never been a woman trade commissioner before. It didn't make any difference, but it was an important precedent, if you like.
Was there any kind of preparation for your ultimate responsibility for foreign affairs? It
was, actually, in two particular ways. One was that I worked very closely with the 27, as they were then, Croatia hadn't joined, countries. And getting a trade deal, I finished the South Korea trade deal, did the final negotiations for that. And I opened the Canada trade deal and did some of the big problems we had with the United States, I managed to resolve. Beef and bananas, as I recall.
Bananas, I remember bananas, yeah.
Some of them have been going for 25 years, so it's good to get them solved.
Yeah.
And that meant that I was quite well known in some capitals, but also in some countries. So I'd been to China several times because there was always issues, of course, with trade with China. I'd been to meet with the South Koreans and had done the negotiations in Seoul myself for the final part of it. And I knew quite a lot of other countries. And foreign ministers and trade ministers sometimes were the same, but certainly you would come across people. So there was a sense that I knew a little bit about what was coming.
I remember a bit about the bananas because in the borders of Scotland, they were manufacturing very high quality cashmere jerseys and jumpers and things of that kind. And the Americans weren't letting them in because of bananas. Or some would say because of the fact that the party that was in government owed quite a great deal to by way of financial support to someone who just happened to be growing a lot of bananas. Isn't that right?
I never heard that before, but certainly there were lots of what they call the carousel. Yeah. So what the Americans did, which was quite neat, not from our point of view, but from their point of view, they would choose a group of products that would be from different parts of Europe. So it would be San Pellegrino water, it might be some cheese, whatever. And that group of products would not be allowed in without huge tariffs for 2 years, which would cause real problems for the manufacturers and for the trade. And then they would change the group of products. So it was a carousel, it would move around. and there'll be a different group of products. We had to stop that, which we did.
And how long did you serve as the Trade Commissioner?
1 year.
1 year?
Yeah.
And can you tell us what your reaction was? Because something rather similar was happening as had happened in relation to trade. Your fate, if that be the right word,
fate's good word.
as the leader in foreign policy for the EU, was being discussed again without any reference to you.
That's right. Well, so there were two things going on at the same time. One is that obviously there were domestic discussions here about what portfolio they would want for the next commission, because that was important. And I think my view was that there was a very definite desire to look at economics first and foremost, which I completely understood. And that wasn't for me. So there were much better people than I could ever be on that. And I wasn't looking to stay anywhere. I'd given up my apartment. I was coming home.
You'd packed your suitcase.
I'd packed my suitcase. I literally packed the suitcase, yeah. And separately to that, there was a big discussion going on about the big jobs that had been created because of the Lisbon Treaty. And that was especially relevant because when you're putting the jobs together, you're mixing two big things, which is which countries, i.e. geography, and which politics, i.e. essentially the three big groupings that we know as Conservative, Labour and Liberal. And that depended on the elections in Europe. And then you might occasionally think, oh, we ought to do something about gender because most of the jobs had traditionally, in fact, all of the jobs had traditionally gone to men. And so I found myself in a situation where what was being discussed was that Britain needed to get a good job out of this whole Lisbon Treaty thing, that they needed a woman somewhere in the mix because all of the big jobs that had been given had already been given to men, and they needed somebody who wasn't a Conservative because the Conservatives had won the elections and therefore taken the presidential jobs. Mm-hmm. And as the President of the Commission said to me, woman, British, Socialist Party. Who do you think they've heard of in Berlin or Paris? And that's no disrespect to my colleagues here. It's simply that I was around and about. So it is, I'm afraid, right time, right place. So it didn't quite feel like that to me. And so I once again watched myself. I'd packed my suitcases to go home for the weekend because we thought they were going to take hours and hours to do all of these jobs in the European Council. And the whole place kind of stopped while that happened. So I was going to head home late on a Thursday night and have a long weekend. And then I sort of halfway through the evening thought, perhaps I shouldn't get the Eurostar, just in case, because you could kind of feel things moving. Well, thank God I didn't, because otherwise I would have been absolutely in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I want to ask you about your, I use a neutral word, activity in the Balkans, which eventually led to you and others being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Can you explain how that came about?
Yes, we were nominated by both sides of the aisle in Congress and then by the European Parliament. It was the year Malala quite rightly won, by the way, just to be clear. And it was the two prime ministers and myself. So many of you know the history of the Balkans, so I'm not going to try and explain everything that had happened. But we were trying to find ways to resolve the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo. Serbia does not recognize Kosovo as a country, but sees it as part of Serbia. Kosovo declared independence and was recognized by most, but not all, countries. And there are still members of the European Union who do not formally recognize Kosovo, largely for domestic reasons to do with issues internal to them. We had a real problem in the north of Kosovo, which was like the Wild West. It was extremely hard to police. We had NATO troops there protecting the Serb Orthodox monasteries. We had police there. We had customs officials. We were trying to manage gates that led between Serbia and Kosovo in terms of people moving across the borders, and they'd been set fire to. We could only take our customs officials in by helicopter. It was a mess. And so I suggested that we had the beginnings of a dialogue between the both sides, and they nominated their prime ministers to come and meet me in what was a very challenging day. If they were here, they would tell you they were sweating, and it was very obvious they were sweating. It was very difficult for them because the animosity between the two sides was huge. They were the same age, they lived in the same region, they had never met. And to come into my office and be prepared to sit down with each other was going to create for them huge problems back home. So it was a very difficult thing to do. And I brought them in and told them separately, this would be a meeting of 1 hour. They would sit with one translator each. I would sit with one official. There would be one photograph. And after the photograph was taken, the memory card, remember those? Memory card would come out and it would be handed to me in front of them. And it would stay with me until they agreed it could be released or not. And they would talk each, I would speak first, then they would each speak, and at the end of the hour we'd see where we were. And at the end of the hour it became obvious that there was the beginning, just that glimmer that you get, just that feeling that there's just the chance that we might be able to do something. So I invited them back a couple of weeks later for dinner. And the next day they allowed me to release the photograph, and it went around the world. The State Department sent me pictures of it appearing in newspapers in parts of Africa. I remember in Pakistan it was front page news in all kinds of places, because this was, in its way, such a dramatic moment that they'd even been in the same room. And we continued to meet, often for 14 or 15 hours a day when we got together, because we had to try and work through some very practical propositions. We weren't asking Serbia to recognize Kosovo. We weren't asking Kosovo to be other than a country, but we were going to bump up against those red lines in order to try and help the people living in the north, the Wild West, to have a better life. And at the end of it, they signed the Brussels Agreement with me, which was the beginnings of the process. Still got a long way to go, but it was, in its own way, a very special moment.
I bet. Well, another special moment, of course, was the JCPOA, in which you had a hand. Can you give us a description about that, of the same kind you've just done in relation to the Balkans?
I spent 4.5 years negotiating with two Iranian regimes, Ahmadinejad as president and Rouhani, night and day.
They were rather different people, weren't
Very
they?
different people, very different. And everything about it was different. Not least the language we worked in, because we suddenly moved to working in English, but also the desire that was very clear from Rouhani's regime that they wanted an agreement. Now, the two things just to say about it very quickly is that, in a way, there were two negotiations going on, because there were 6 countries who represented the permanent members of the Security Council, so that's Russia, China, US, France and Britain, and Germany added on, because the original negotiations had been begun by the 3 Europeans, France, Britain and Germany, to which the 3 other permanent members of the Security Council came into it.
They were described as a 3+3, I think.
So it was either the E3 plus 3 or the P5 plus 1. Yeah. In the book, I just talk about the 6. Right. It's easier. But we had to get, if you could imagine, a common position that all 6 countries would stick to. And my job as chair of the negotiations, first of all, with tremendous help from a great team in Brussels, was to get a position that each would agree they would stick to, regardless of whether they agreed with all of it. And the difference between what the Americans wanted and needed in an agreement, and if you like, what perhaps the Russians and Chinese needed, was big. And you had a sort of fanned out spectrum in between of what countries felt was necessary. But we managed it, and in the end, the agreed position everybody stuck to, which, considering for the last part, I led the negotiations until the very final few weeks, when I'd already left office but agreed to carry on with them, when I handed over, because at that moment of signing you need the person in office, not the person out of office, which is me. I handed over to Federica, my successor. But that position was held despite the fact that we had the crisis in Ukraine at the same time, and that I would be flying from the Iran talks with the Russians, who were our partners, to Kyiv, where the Russians were far from that. They had violated the country of Ukraine, taken Crimea, moved into the Donbass. But we managed to keep the Iran talks going throughout, and the Russians stuck to the position. So it's an interesting example of how, even when things are extremely difficult, having a place where you can talk is important, because in those weeks and weeks we spent together, we didn't just talk about centrifuges or what was happening in the different sites, or heavy water reactors versus light water reactors and all of that. There were opportunities to talk about other things, but also that we were able to continue to try and solve that problem. And in the context of a world where climate change is the biggest crisis we face, and we need everybody engaged in that, it's an important and valuable thing to remember, I think, about it. And then the second part of the negotiations, of course, is with the Iranians themselves, where we worked through enormous detail with technical teams with us at all times of exactly how to make sure that you could have confidence that Iran was not building a bomb. And when the JCPOA was signed, you could have confidence they were not building a bomb. They were the most monitored country on earth in terms of what they were doing, and we had ensured by the way that the deal was done that you could be confident about it. It's a very different situation today.
I want to open it to questions, but I just want one sentence on where you think we are now on the JCPOA.
I never declare anything dead, because it's always the case that there will be something happening somewhere, and events make opportunities, if you like. But I think it was a huge mistake for the US to withdraw, and it not only damaged the JCPOA and made it impossible to deliver the things we said we'd deliver, which were economic, but also it took away something quite remarkable, which was that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council had worked together on something for years, and now they don't work together at all.
Rather a sad ending to a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Well, as I think I said a little earlier, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and I see one already. Wait until you have the microphone, and perhaps you'd stand up and say who you are.
I'm John Everard. I'm one of the former diplomats who you quite rightly expected to turn up today. Many thanks for your kind words about my former profession. You, for several years, headed up the European External Action Service. As you probably know, as an institution, it's been quite heavily criticised, both because it is alleged far too many of the good jobs go to people who have the right passport rather than to the most competent. And secondly, because it's the wrong size. It neither has the size and capability of the US State Department, nor the agility of the individual national diplomatic services. It sort of falls between two stools. What do you think?
So I would say, first of all, that I'd give it a chance. Unlike the diplomatic services of most countries, it's been there, since what? It's been there 10 years, 12 years now. So it's very difficult to judge something brand new when others have had hundreds of years of perfecting what they've got. I appointed nobody on passport. I appointed everyone on merit. I appointed every head of delegation and every senior management person in the service, because it seemed to me the only way to be sure that we got the right expertise was to do it that way. But it's a service that will find its way over time. I'm often asked, is it any good? And I say, wait 25 years and let's have a look at it then. And that's simply because I just don't think you can judge it yet. It's gone through 3 high representatives. It's gone through huge economic challenges in Europe. It's gone through differing views from different member states about its purpose. It's gone through some people thinking it's a good idea and some people not. And it needs to, have a chance, really. And the people who work within it are doing the very best they can in what are quite difficult circumstances.
All right. At the back? at the very second back row. I think the microphone's approaching you.
Hello.
Please say who you are.
Yes, my name is Human. I'm a researcher over money laundry and...
Could you speak up? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Human. I'm a researcher over money laundry and counterterrorism in one of the Russell Group universities in the United Kingdom. I have two questions. First, I was just wondering, what's your prediction of the future of the Iranian regime with the current governors? Because I believe, I'm half Iranian, I was born there. I believe all the governors of Iran support the supreme leader. So no matter are they from the conservatives one or the other sides, all of them are supporting the leader. So what's your prediction of the future of the nuclear deal with Iran? And the second thing is about Azerbaijan and Armenia. As you're aware, now there is a blockade in Nagorno-Karabakh, and there's a genocide happening over Armenians. So I also want to know what's your prediction about the future of the dictator of Azerbaijan. Thank you.
That was interesting because in both of the predictions you asked for, you gave the answer that you believe to be the case, which is always, for me, fascinating. I'm not going to make predictions because there are so many variations and possibilities of what could happen. I think I'm clear that for Iran, what we want to see is a recognition that the future should lie in a very different path to the one that Iran is on. And that the people, I think, are becoming more vocal. You know, it's a highly educated population of extraordinary people who want the future that they want for themselves. And economic issues, which were at the heart of the whole reason, I think, President Rouhani was wanting to do a deal, will still remain a big factor in how people react in the future. In terms of Nagorno-Karabakh, there's been some changes. A friend of mine from the State Department has been working hard on trying to look at what could be done between certainly the two leaders, Armenia and Azerbaijan. I'd like to see that move forward. It's been stuck for a long, long time. But, you know, as you point out in the way that you address the issue, you recognise that there's real challenges in what's happening there.
Yeah. Lady there, yes. First, 1, 2, 3, 4 back, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Would you mind standing up?
Yes, thank you. I'm a diplomat myself. My name is Vula Javeleki. I was posted in London, in our London-based embassy between 2015 and 2020.
Which embassy?
Greece.
Greek embassy, Greece. Yeah. And I cannot resist the temptation to ask you about Brexit. I was here during the rather dramatic unfold of developments in that period, and seizing the opportunity, taking from what you mentioned about the long-term thinking and long-term building up a sort of a solid relation, and seeing the whole now from a distance, both physical and chronological. I wonder whether the whatever Brexit meant was some kind of outcome of our mutual failure or lack in understanding each other and building up a quite solid relation, an honest relation. And in the light of the recent deal that Rishi Sunak and the European Commission reached a few days ago, I would like your take, your opinion, whether you think that there is now some room to start building up a more honest relation, EU and UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Rilesh. And as I said to you earlier, I think we're all thinking about Greece today in the light of the terrible train crash that happened in the north of the country this morning. I don't get involved much in domestic politics. I think what looks clear is that there has been a positive agreement finally on Northern Ireland, and for the people of Northern Ireland that's incredibly important. It also has the potential to pave the way to try and work out what the relationship in the future with Europe could look like. We kind of had Brexit and people said that they didn't want what existed, but there were lots of variations of what then could exist. And I think we are not yet in a place where there's a great sense of what would make the best sense for Britain and for Europe together. I was particularly sad that we didn't have foreign policy and security relations right from the beginning, because there seemed no reason why we shouldn't. We share the same values, we are there together, we're there together in trying to support Ukraine and so on. So I didn't understand why that became something that they rejected in government. I'm sure politically in Parliament that would have been an obvious thing to do. So I really hope that we start moving forward. And this could be the beginning of a change, which I hope will bring stronger relations both economically and politically between us.
Well, given the, if I might interject, given the irresponsibility of President Trump, not least at the Brussels summit when he threatened to bring the United States out of NATO, then having a strong European relationship would obviously be a pretty good piece of insurance, would you think?
Well, I think it's important anyway. I mean, you know, the US has been complaining about the lack of willingness of European nations to support NATO effectively way back from JFK, I think was the first time that he talked about it, and every president since. Right. The difference was Trump was of a different order in terms of what he might have been prepared to do. So the question then becomes, in defence terms through NATO, having the strength of Europe, but in economic terms, especially through the EU, it's this massive economic bloc that at times I don't think feels its own strength. To use that to be a really strong and important force to promote the values we hold and to hold people to account through sanctions and so on. So there's a kind of duality there that would make sense. There's a lot of talk about European defence. I chaired the European Defence Agency as one of my many functions. And that worked very closely with NATO. It was about research and development primarily, improvised explosive devices, helicopter training, mid-air refueling, all kinds of pieces of work that were incredibly important for NATO, but incredibly important for Europe too. And it was a way of supporting. So these need not be in contradiction with each other. This is about trying to find ways that make sense of offering the best possible support. Those days we did not predict what would happen in Ukraine, but here we are with a war in Europe.
Yeah. They did, yes. I'll come back to you in a moment.
Hello, I'm Jane Kinnenmont from the European Leadership Network. So following up on that war in Europe, do you see any scope currently for European diplomacy with Russia, as you described, happening back in 2014? Or do you think those doors are closed for now?
It's incredibly difficult to imagine that there's much to talk about with President Putin, who as you know, I met many times. And certainly talked to him about Ukraine when I visited Belarus to do a very early discussion in 2014. Having said all that, what I do believe very strongly is that it's important that Ukraine is the country that decides what's going to happen in terms of when and what kind of negotiations. But it does so with as much support as possible. And you need to think about the process of negotiation long before you're in the negotiation. In other words, what are we going to talk about? Who's going to be in the room? Where are you going to meet? Who's going to sit around the table? What are the issues that we really think could be addressed? Even if you have complete victory for one side, for Ukraine, there's still people who've disappeared into Russia we need to get back. There are still Russians living in Crimea that need to go home or not. There are lots of things, not least the rebuilding of a nation, that need to be discussed. And the challenge that I found was that unless you've got a process in your mind and already beginning to tick, you end up spending weeks, if not months, arguing about the shape of the table and where you're actually going to meet. I spent a long time arguing about which flags should be in the room once, and I spent a lot of time arguing about where we should go for talks with the Ahmadinejad Iranian people, and I mean a long time. Once you've done all that, you start to talk about the real stuff. So I would be saying, look, it's important that you think, where would you like to meet, and how's that going to work, and who's going to be there to discuss which of these issues, what's going to be most important for Ukraine, because this is no good if what we end up with is a sort of ceasefire thing that means that you get regrouping and then the return. What I will say to everybody is whatever happens, it will be probably quite messy, because the end of something, having negotiated things, it's impossible to imagine a circumstance where everybody feels that everything has been completely done the way they want it. And so preparing for that's quite important.
Yes, here. The microphone's on its way. Hold on.
Donald Anderson, House of Lords. Cathy, the Russia very cheaply is partially replacing the old colonial powers in much of Africa. France now has been chased out of Burkina Faso and Mali. The vote on Ukraine in the General Assembly showed much of the old Commonwealth Africa refusing to take a stand in spite of Russian aggression. So what price the Commonwealth political cooperation, and how can Europe improve the position in Africa south of the Sahara?
It's a really important point, Donald, and it's lovely to see you. And I think we should not underestimate. It's a bit like my point about the Arab Spring, that there is a sense that this is all happening outside and happening led by people who don't actually connect with the countries that are being asked to worry about Ukraine. So for some African leaders, this is a European war that's got nothing to do with them. It is another European war, and we all expect them to do things, whereas when there is a war closer to where they are, they feel we don't necessarily engage as much. I'm putting it incredibly politely. It's not how they would put it to me, but those are the messages, and you understand what I'm saying. And there are two things that we have neglected. One is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, because certainly again in my time in office, I always had this dream that about year 3, I would be able to spend a huge amount of time engaging and supporting economic growth, international issues with Africa, talking to them about all kinds of things. And crisis after crisis and dramatic events happened that meant I never really did. And that, I think, is a consequence of all of these issues that have arisen, is that we're not talking to countries that we then expect to support us. Linked to that, you have both where China has been very active in parts of Africa and also where Russia has been very active. And the Russians have been active in all kinds of places. I went to a meeting in Palau in the Pacific, which is incredibly difficult to get to, apart from anything else. Very beautiful. And there were the Russians already at the same meeting, already engaging, already looking for support in the Security Council, if any of them were there, or in the General Assembly, where they all were there. Really, really interesting that they took a lot of trouble. So we are having to think, I think, all of us, not just the EU, but all of us, about how do we engage countries effectively, politically and economically, in order that they understand why this has got direct implications for them.
I promised that there are two ladies in a row. You first, one closer. All right, and behind you? Immediately behind you?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Was that me?
Yes. No, I'm sorry. I can't see. Oh, yes, I beg your pardon. You've asked already. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Yes. But
Thanks
we've
very
got
much.
someone that will pick up the baton at the back. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Katharina Rauscher, Deputy Head of Mission at the Austrian Embassy, and served on the Austrian PSC team in Brussels during your term in office, so great to see you again. My question is really quite a general one. I think one of the biggest challenges of the EU's common foreign and security policy is, of course, that it requires unanimity. So just out of interest, really, I'd be interested to know, looking back at your time in office, what you feel was your biggest, perhaps, regret or frustration, where you felt like we, as in terms of the EU External Action Service, would have liked to do more, but member states just wouldn't let us because they couldn't agree on it. And just from a member state point of view, I just wanted to say External Action Service is extremely useful for small and medium countries So we value it enormously, particularly now also here in the UK, which is of course a third country now. Thank you.
I don't really have, it's lovely to see you, by the way. I thought I recognised the name, and I couldn't work out why I would have known you, so it's very nice to see you again. I don't have any actual regrets about that. What I do think is that I would be inclined to stick with unanimity. I know there's a lot of talk about, trying to get a stronger position using qualified majority. But on foreign policy issues, I don't want countries going off and saying, well, I don't agree with that, so I'm going to have my own thing. The strength for the High Representative and for the service was in being able to say, I speak on behalf of 28 countries or 27 or whatever it is, not 24 and there's a couple that don't agree. Because the couple that don't agree will let it be known they don't agree, and it'll be the same ones pretty much all the time, I can predict, on some issues. And I want them in the tent, not out the tent. So it seemed to me that there was an important element of holding everyone together. I chaired 50 Foreign Affairs Councils and 12 informal councils. We never voted, we never failed to get an agreement. I'd like to tell you it's because I'm a brilliant chair of a meeting, but actually it was because Brussels is the one place in the world where people come to find a solution. It's the only place where diplomats are really, really required to not end up standing behind their national position, even some of the very awkward ones at times. Because if they do that, they've failed, and they have to go home. In Brussels, you've succeeded when there is a common position. Only then. And there's nowhere else where that's true. And so it's actually works in a very, as you know from the PSC, a very challenging and difficult way. There were moments when I would put forward wording, for example, on the original taking of Crimea, which I speak of in the book, where I put forward the word invasion, because that's what all the military told me by definition it was, and it was changed. There were moments when you know the word is going to get changed. And it's going to get changed because you're trying to bring countries with you, either whose relationships with third countries are more challenging, or who simply, it's just not a big issue for them. And if you look at the geography, I had the advantage of an expertise always available to me, because there would be a country of the 28 that knew more about the issue or the nation or the history than anyone else. But I also had countries who were literally on the border of the problem, and countries who were hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. What you got was a willingness to support each other, knowing that when the next issue came up, that support would be returned. But it also meant that sometimes the strongest position had to be pulled back a little bit in order to bring everybody else up with it. I never regretted that. I always thought that was, in the end, a better place to be with everybody signed up than risk having a stronger position, but with the number of countries saying, well, that's not for me, growing. So for me, and unanimity is where I would stick, and I completely understand that it's easy for me to say that. Final point on it all. When you're sitting with the foreign ministers of the 28 countries, you are mindful that there's always an election somewhere. So at any given moment, these people are on their last meeting or their first meeting, and they're in strange coalitions, or they come from political parties that are very different to where the leader will come from, that have been forced together for one reason or another. And the politics of a country that you thought you knew will dramatically change overnight into something very different. So actually, again, holding everybody to unanimity means you don't get tossed around so much by those who would just push it in a different direction.
The clock behind me clearly has a mind of its own, but my watch says it's 2 o'clock, and on that basis we have, of course, to come to an end. Thank you very much to those who came, thank you for those who asked questions, but in particular thank you, Cathy, for what wasn't so much a speech as a masterclass.
Thank you.